Chapter 10, Key Issue 4, is about farmers and the economic difficulties faced by these farmers. We'll look at the impact of population growth on trade in developing countries and how that affects farming. Look at the distinctive challenges for developing countries to increase their food supply, and we'll look at the impact of overproduction and market access on farming in developing countries. We'll also look at the contribution of expanding exports and more farmland and how that affects world food supply, the contribution of fishing to the world's food supply, and the contribution of higher productivity to world food supply. So in developing countries, subsistence farmers must feed an increasing number of people because we have rapid population growth. There's a higher NIR in developing countries. So you have more people, but you have smaller quality farms. So people are still primarily growing farms for just themselves and their families with a little excess to sell on small amounts of land with primarily human labor and some animal labor. So how do we increase that food supply? You can increase it through the intensification of production through new farming methods or by leaving land fallow for shorter periods of time. If you leave land fallow for less time, you'll have less fertile soil, so it'll do the opposite. In the long run, it means you'll have less productivity on that land. So here is some more people getting terraced rice fields ready. So you can see them plowing it away so they could plant the seedlings there and then flood the paddies. So by increasing the amount of machinery you use here or increasing the type of seeds you use here, you could increase their productivity. So instead of growing, they have to grow food for, another problem is they have to grow food for export instead of direct consumption. Because if they've adopted the international trade approach to development, they need to start selling their food. And so people in the developed world, we like to buy fruits and vegetables all year long. So if you enjoy eating blueberries every single month of the year, realize that if you're getting blueberries from like Peru, people are growing blueberries there to sell instead of food for their families. Another problem is we overproduce things in commercial farming. So commercial farmers often suffer from low incomes because they can produce more food than is demanded by consumers in developed countries. So sometimes you convert so much of your field to growing, dragon fruit or quinoa, and your growth outstrips the demand. And so you're left with more food than people even want. So the prices become very low. Like the U.S. government has policies that try to address excess production. So farmers are encouraged to avoid producing crops when they're in excess supply. The government pays farms when certain commodity prices are low, and the government buys surplus production and sells or donates it to the foreign governments. So in developed countries, we overproduce materials as well, but the U.S. has some steps in place to avoid that. So in the U.S., ideally, if we have too much corn, you'll stop producing it. Although we don't, we subsidize corn. So maybe if we have too much wheat or too many tomatoes in the market, they encourage farmers to cut down on producing it. They also subsidize farmers. They give them money to make sure they're making like the minimum price they need to turn a profit. And they often buy the surplus and then sell it back to developing countries. What does the importance of access to market mean? So if you're looking at the access to market, we're looking at a model that was developed in Germany, and it's called the von Thunen model. The von Thunen model was developed in an estate in Europe, in Western Europe, in the 19th century. And so many parts of this model don't really apply to the modern world, but some do. So if you look at your picture in the book, you're going to see that there are specific rings that are grown in rings around cities. And the first ring, you're going to have perishable foods like milk. And the second ring, you're going to have foods that are difficult to transport like wood. And the third ring, you're going to have crop and pasture lands. And in the fourth ring, you're going to have spacious lands for animal grazing. And you can scale this model up to look at it for national and global markets. But if you look at von Thunen, you can see that some pros are that it's to organize land. It's an organized model. It's easy to read. It does show a perfect world scenario with uniform land quality. And it's really been developed for the small scale. But some negatives with the von Thunen model is it assumes all land is uniform. It doesn't account for the variance in physical geography. It can lead to transportation cost changes. and it doesn't consider social factors. But the most important thing is that this model explains the cost and proximity. It costs more money to transport. It costs more money to transport things. So you want to have things that you're paying for transport if they are less perishable. So it's worth it to spend more money on land if your materials will go bad if they have to be transported a long time. So today you'll still find dairy farms closer to commercial areas, like we talked about with the milk shed, than you necessarily will wheat fields. We don't have to have any wheat fields in Florida at all, and we get plenty of wheat products. We get bread, we get flour, we get everything we need. It's not going to go bad. It can be processed in Kansas and shipped all over the country. But we do have dairy production within Florida because, even if we got dairy shipped from Wisconsin and it wasn't bad yet, because it wouldn't be, we would have to sell it very quickly and drink it very quickly. And so it's worth the higher cost of land to have a dairy farm closer to urban areas than it would be worth the cost of land to have grain farms near urban areas. So you're really balancing the cost of transport, the cost of spoilage, the cost of the final product, and the cost of land. And so in that way, von Thunen's model is still very useful. How do we increase the world's food supply? We have 4 strategies that are being employed to distribute food to everyone in the world. We want to increase exports from countries with surpluses. We want to expand the land area that's used for agriculture. We want to expand fishing, and we want to increase the productivity of land now used for agriculture. And all of these goals have their pros and cons. All right, so increasing exports from countries with surpluses. On a global scale, agriculture projects are moving mostly from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere. So like the U.S. is the world's leading exporter of grain. We are responsible for half of the world's corn or maize exports. Our global shares decreased from 18 to 19% in the 70s to 10 or 11% in the 21st century because we have a lot more agriculture exports from Latin America and Southeast Asia, but we still have a big chunk of that market. So here you can see that we are net exporters. We are still selling a lot of our food. Expanding agricultural land. So if we can use more agricultural land, we can feed more people. But we have a lot of problems with that. One, some of the land that could be used for farmland is in protected areas like the rainforest or areas that should be protected. And so you're looking at converting forest land to farmland, so increasing deforestation, which we don't want to do. And we're also overusing water. So a lot of agriculture land is being abandoned because of lack of water. So if you have land degradation that makes former farmland resemble a desert-like state, we call that desertification. And the rate of desertification is increasing. We also have land that used to be farmable but is now being flooded. So people are abandoning farmland because there's too much or too little water. So expanding land may not be the answer. And here you can see the agricultural land and the amount of population, and the idea is that we need to have more farmland to feed more people. But we could just have new technology to better use the land we have, or look at expanding farmland in a way that is non-traditional. So using former brownfields as places to grow farm food within a city, indoor gardening, things like that. You could expand fishing, but not wild fishing in the oceans, because we have already increased our human consumption of food from the sea from 27 million metric tons to 110 million metric tons. Our global fish production has increased from 36 to 145 million metric tons. Only 2/3 of the fish caught from the ocean is directly consumed by humans. It might be used for fish oil or like cat food or other things like that. So if we expand our fishing of wild fish, we're going to look at the rapid depletion of fish in the ocean. And we already are looking at unsustainable catch practices. And so scientists estimate that more than half of the fish in the ocean are going to go extinct if we maintain our rate of fishing. And so if we talk about expanding our fishing, we need to look at aquaculture or aquafarming. And that's when you're going to cultivate seafood under controlled conditions. So it's like a farm for fish. And here you can see the fish consumption. Developing countries have high consumption. Developed countries are a little bit lower, but world consumption is really high. If you look at the amount of fish that's caught through capture versus aquaculture, capture is far higher. And we really want to work on increasing our aquaculture fishing practices, but in a sustainable way, so we don't spread things like sea lice or parasites or diseases to wild fish populations. The last strategy is to increase productivity. And so the rapid diffusion of more productive agricultural techniques during the 1970s and 80s is called the Green Revolution. So we had the original agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. And then during the Industrial Revolution, we had another agricultural revolution. That's when we started to use things like tractors and machines. We started to mechanize farming. And then in the 1970s and 80s, we had the more recent revolution called the Green Revolution. And what was part of this Green Revolution was the expanded use of fertilizers and new higher yield seeds. So we started to have things like miracle wheat seeds or rice seeds or high yield corn. So the Green Revolution allowed agricultural productivity to outpace population growth. The problem with a lot of these techniques is they're expensive, so developing countries can't afford them. So if you see this map here, you can see that food production was able to kind of keep pace with population growth, as long as you had access to these technological farming methods. So the best way to increase our world's food supply is to rely on sustainable agriculture. These are practices that preserve and enhance environmental quality, not just for the sake of being environmentally responsible, but so that we can produce enough food for this generation and the generation after. You probably don't think about soil as anything other than dirt, but soil is a precious, precious resource. Once it's gone, it takes millions of years to rebuild. It's not renewable. So if we look at practices that are sustainable as farming, it might change our system, but it's really best in the long haul, and it's a long-term solution for the global food production. So we need to look at our land management, sensitive land management. We want to limit the use of chemicals, so when we need them, they work. The problem with using chemicals as a first solution, when I say chemicals, I'm referring to like insecticides. When you really need them to work, sometimes the insects have developed resistance. So just like antibiotics should be used when you have a bacterial infection that you need to get rid of, insecticides shouldn't be used as preventative measures. They should be used when you need them. And we want to integrate crops and livestock in a better way. So this chapter is about the development of agriculture, how we need food to survive. The amount of food and dietary composition varies between developed and developing countries. We talked about where you would find subsistence farmers, where you would find commercial farming, and what are the different challenges when you need to look at challenges to raising enough food for your population. So that's it for chapter 10.